What is going on, everybody? Dan with GearFocus here, and in today's video we're going to take an in-depth look at the new Canon R5. Now this video is going to be a pretty long video, so I'm going to put the timestamps to the different sections down in the description down below, but for now, let's go ahead and roll that intro. We can jump right into it. So this video is going to be a complete walkthrough of the Canon R5, which is Canon's latest and their flagship model in their mirrorless line. So before we do anything, let's take a look at the body of the camera so that we know what all of the buttons and these switches do. Now, if we take a look here at the back of the camera, we're going to start from the left side. The first button that we're going to see is the rate button. Now, this button is used for when you want to rate the images that you're taking, so you can either have a 1-star or a 5-star or something like that, and if you press and hold it, you can actually record a memo for that image. Next up, we have the menu button. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And to the right of that, we have our electronic viewfinder, or our EVF. Directly below that, we have the sensor for the EVF, so that's how the camera decides whether or not it's going to display the image in the EVF or on the back of the screen. This is something that you can customize in the menu, and we will get to that in a little bit. And directly to the right of the EVF is the diopter adjustment. So if you've ever been looking through your EVF and it looks a little bit blurry, try spinning that dial. It'll adjust the focus point for your EVF. Now, directly underneath of our EVF, we have our main LCD screen, which is a touch screen. And to the right of that, we have our navigation knob up at the top. We can use this to navigate around the menus if we're looking through the EVF, or we can use this to change where our focus point is in our image. This is very similar to how the 1DX bodies function. Below that, we have our zoom button. And directly below that, we have our info button. This will allow us to scroll through our different parameters for information that we've set in our menu, which I'll get to a little later on. And directly to the right of that, we have our Q button, which will do a bunch of various different things depending on what screen the camera is on. Now below that, we have our scroll wheel. This is really great because we can assign this to a different function. Personally, I assign this to ISO, but you can assign this to a bunch of different functions. This is also how we scroll through our menus. And in the middle of that is the set button. You can think of that as kind of like the OK button. And below that, we have our playback button as well as our trash can button. Now, if we go back up to the top of the camera, we have our AF on button. This is basically the same thing as half pressing your shutter. And to the right of that, we have two more assignable buttons. So now let's take a look at the top of the camera, starting on the grip side. At the front of the camera, we obviously have our shutter button. Directly below that, we have the multi-function button. This can be set up to do a number of different things, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Behind that, we have our scroll wheel. This is another customizable wheel. I personally use this one for my shutter speed. Directly behind that scroll wheel, we have our record button. We also have our lock button, our illumination button, as well as another scroll wheel and the mode. Now, the mode button is used to switch back and forth between photo and video mode, and that scroll wheel on the back is another customizable wheel. I have that one set to my aperture. Now, directly below that, we have our LCD screen, which will give us our exposure readouts. And directly below that screen, we have our hot shoe. Now, if we take a look at the other side of the camera, we have our on-off switch as well as our sensor indicator. If you've ever seen that symbol on your camera and wondered what that is where your sensor is in your camera. So if you really wanted to get super accurate with your distance measurements, that's the point that you're going to measure off of. All right, so now let's take a look at the left side of the camera. Starting from the front, at the top, we have our 3.5mm line input. So you would use this if you were going to use like a shotgun mic or something like that. And directly below that, we have our headphone output. And below our headphone output is our network connection. Now, towards the back of the camera, we have our USB-C port, which can be used for a number of different things, like our firmware update that we're going to get into in a little bit here, or we can use that to transfer images or anything like that. You can also use your USB-C port to charge your battery while it's inside the camera, but there is a certain protocol that you have to have on your charger in order to be able to do that. And lastly, directly below that, we have our mini HDMI output. So lastly, we're going to take a look at the grip side of the camera, which is where we insert our SD cards and our CFast cards. So before we dive into the menu, I want to make sure that everybody that's watching this video is on the same firmware. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to update the firmware on your camera so that we're all on the same page. So the firmware that I am using in this video is the latest at the time of the filming of this video, which is 1.3. So the first thing that we need to do is download the firmware from Canon's website. So first we're going to go to Canon's support page, and then we're going to click on the button that says drivers and downloads. From there, it's going to automatically scroll down, and we're going to go over to the right where it says firmware and click on that. From here, we're going to go ahead and download our latest firmware. Now, something to keep in mind here is you do have to also have the Canon EOS utility application in order to update your firmware. So make sure that while you're here on this page, you also download that as well. So now once we have everything downloaded, we're going to go ahead and open up our EOS utility, and we're going to go ahead and click on firmware update. After we do that, it's going to check the firmware version on our camera, and we're just going to go ahead and follow the prompts through here. Now, when it asks you to browse for the file, you just want to go to wherever you saved your file. You want to make sure that you have also extracted the file out of the zip folder, or else you won't be able to put it into the camera. So once we find our file, we're going to go ahead and hit open, and then we're going to hit next, and we'll apply our update. Now from here, the rest of the firmware update happens in the camera. So just go ahead and follow the prompts on the back of the camera. Basically, all you're gonna have to do is press OK and then let it do its thing. So now that we have our firmware updated, we can go ahead and jump into the menu system. We're gonna start first on the photo menu. So we wanna make sure that our camera is in photography mode. So our first menu is our shooting menu. This is where we control all of the main shooting aspects of the camera. First, we're going to select our image quality. On this page, we can select whether or not we want to shoot RAW only, shoot JPEG only, or some combination of the two of them. From here, we can also select the size of our JPEG, and if you look at the gray bar on the top, it'll show you how many images you're going to be able to get with those individual settings. Next up, we have the dual pixel RAW menu, and this is basically to enable or disable that. Now, if you don't know what dual pixel RAW is, essentially what happens is the camera will take two separate images and combine them in the camera to make the sharpest image. But something you got to watch out for with dual pixel RAW is it is taking two images, so the file size is going to double. So next up, we have our cropping and aspect ratio. So if you knew that for whatever reason you were always going to have the same aspect ratio, say you were only shooting for Instagram or you were only shooting for whatever, you can set that in camera so that you don't have to crop in post. And in this menu, we have a 1.6 times crop, which is essentially the Super 35 crop, if that's something that you're going for. We have our 1:1 aspect ratio for Instagram or anything that accepts a square format. And then we have our 4:3 and 16:9 options. So on the next page, we have our exposure menu. At the top, we have our exposure compensation, and then directly below that, we have our ISO speed settings. So from here, we can set our ISO speed. We can also set the range for that and also the auto range for that. So if you put your camera in auto ISO mode, you can select which range it goes in between. And then lastly, we can also set our minimum shutter speed. Now, real quick, you don't have to go into your menu to change your ISO setting. You can do that right from the back of the camera, or if you have one of your wheels mapped, you can do it that way as well. Next up, we have our HDR PQ menu, where we can turn that on and off, as well as our shooting and playback menus. Next, we have our auto lighting optimizer. We can turn that on or off, or use several of the different modes. We have our standard mode, our low mode, and our high mode. I usually leave that disabled. Next up, we have our highlight tone priority menu, and we have three options for that. We have your enable, disable, and enhanced. Directly below that, we have our anti-flicker shooting, which we can either enable or disable. And lastly, we have our external speed light control menu. Now, to be 100% honest with you, I don't really know what any of these functions do, but this is where you would go to change those settings if you know what you're doing. In our next menu, we start working our way to our white balance. So at the top, we have the ability to change our white balance. We have a bunch of different options here. We can also set a custom white balance. So in order to use the custom white balance function, what you're gonna do is you're gonna take a picture of a white object, typically a piece of paper, something like that, with your camera. After that, you're gonna go ahead into this menu and you're gonna select that image and select that white piece of paper. Once you've done that, it'll automatically set your white balance for you. Underneath of that, we have our white balance shift and our color spaces. I typically shoot in sRGB. You could also shoot in Adobe RGB. Under that, we have our picture style. I typically shoot in neutral, but you can select a bunch of different profiles. We have our clarity adjustment as well as our lens aberration correction. Next up, we have our noise reduction menu, and the first selection on this is our long exposure noise reduction. This is great if you do a lot of long exposure work. Next up, we have our high ISO noise reduction. That's pretty obvious. It puts some noise reduction on when you're using high ISOs. And lastly, we have our dust delete data. Now in our next menu, we can enable or disable multiple exposures. We can also set up our HDR mode. I typically leave that off, and then we also have our focus bracketing. After that, we have our interval timer, our bulb timer, our shutter mode. Underneath of our shutter mode, we have mechanical shutter, electronic first curtain, and 100% electronic. And lastly, we have release shutter without card. Essentially what that means is you can take a picture without a card in the camera. Now in our next menu, we have the ability to disable or enable our touch shutter. So what that means is you can touch your LCD screen on the back of the camera and it'll take a picture. We also have our image review settings. Personally, I turn image review off. It's very distracting for me, but you can set it to various different times. We also have our high speed display menu, which we can enable or disable. We have our metering timer. And we have our exposure simulation as well as our shooting info display setup. Now this is what I was talking about before when you press the info button on the back of the camera. This is the menu where you select what information you're gonna see on the screen. And in this menu, we can select a bunch of different parameters and you can set that up however you want. We also have the ability to add our histogram and set up our grid and everything like that. And then on the last page, we have our viewfinder display format as well as our display performance. All right, next up we have our autofocus menu. So our first selection here is our autofocus operation. So we can select either one shot or servo. We have our methods. We have a bunch of different options here. We have face tracking. We have our spot autofocus, 1 point, expand area, round, autofocus zones. We have all kinds of different options in here. We also have subject to detect. I have mine set to people. You can set it to people, animals, or have no priority. We have our eye detection, which we can enable or disable. We have continuous autofocus, which we can enable or disable in photo mode. And then lastly, we have our touch, drag, and autofocus settings. This is a really awesome function that I use all the time. Basically, what you're able to do is take your thumb and touch the corner of your screen and drag your focus point around while you're in your viewfinder. In this menu, we can either enable or disable that function. We also have the ability to select where on the screen we position it and also what our positioning method is. Personally, I like to use the bottom right. So now in our next menu, we have our manual focus peaking settings, where we can set our peaking, whether or not it's on or off. We can also set our level and we can set our color. We have our focus guide, whether or not we want to turn that on or off. We also have our AF beam assist firing. Now on the next page, we have our servo autofocus settings, where we can select a bunch of different options. We have the ability to select for sport mode or an animal mode. We can also select our tracking sensitivity as well as the acceleration and deceleration on that tracking. Now in the next menu, we have our lens electronic manual focus. We also have our one-shot autofocus release prior selection, our switching track subject selection, lens drive when autofocus is impossible. Basically, this is when the camera will take a photo without knowing that something is in focus. We can also limit our autofocus methods as well as select our autofocus menu selection control, which is currently mapped to the multi-function button. And lastly, we have our orientation linked autofocus point, which basically means if you have your focus point set to the bottom right of the image when you are on a horizontal or landscape mode, that when you flip to your portrait mode, it'll stay in that same spot. Now on the last page of the autofocus menu, we have our initial servo autofocus point. So this is where your autofocus point will start. We also have our focus ring rotation for your RF lenses, as well as the focus ring sensitivity, our aperture sensitivity and focus point, as well as our electronic full-time manual focus. Our next menu here is our playback menu. So this is where we deal with all of the images that are already captured inside the camera. So first we can protect certain images or make sure that certain images don't get deleted. We can then erase images, rotate stills in camera, change the movie rotate info. We can also rate and copy images on this menu as well. Now on the next page, we can select our print order and our photo book setup. Fortunately, I don't have any compatible images right now. Next, we have our raw processing, which we can select the images and select our range, as well as our DP RAW settings, which we can also select our images for. We have our resize and cropping, as well as our HEIF to JPEG. So on the fourth page, we have our slideshow settings, as well as our image search conditions. We have our magnification settings. Also, we have our image jump. So when we use this wheel up top, however fast we scroll it, it'll jump, 10 images or whatever we set that to. We also have the ability to switch our two front and back dials, as well as that rate and memo button that I was talking about earlier on in the video, as well as the memo audio quality. So if we recorded a memo using that button, the audio quality that would be recorded in. And now the last page is our playback information display, as well as our highlight alert. We have our autofocus point display. So if we wanted to show where our autofocus point was in our image while we were looking at it, then we could use this menu for that. Next, we have our playback grid, our movie play count, as well as our HDMI HDR output. Next up, we have our connection menu. This is a pretty simple menu, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. First, we have our Wi-Fi/Bluetooth connection. We have our airplane mode on or off. We also have our Wi-Fi settings, our Bluetooth settings, the name of the camera, as well as our GPS device and image transfers. And then on that second page, we can go ahead and reset all of those settings that we just did. So now let's jump into our main settings menu. This is a pretty substantial menu, so bear with me here. This is going to be a long section. So on the first page of this menu, we have our record function and card/folder selection. So we can select where our images are going on our card. Underneath of that, we have our filing numbering and our file name. We can actually create a custom prefix for our files. And then next we have our format card option. We have the auto rotate, which personally I like to leave on the computer, so it'll auto rotate when I get into the computer. Next, we add the movie rotate info, as well as our date and time. Next, we have our language, our video system, our help text size, whether or not we have the beep, our headphone volume, our power saving, and eco mode. In the next menu, we have our screen and viewfinder display info. We have a bunch of different options to select here, whether or not we want it to auto switch or select manually. Next, we have our screen brightness and our viewfinder brightness and our screen and viewfinder color tone. Then we have the ability to fine tune our viewfinder color tone, as well as the user interface magnification. Next up, we have our HDMI resolution menu. We have our touch control menu, as well as the multifunction lock. Underneath of the multifunction lock, we have a bunch of different options that we can select. Next, we have shutter at shutdown. Personally, I like to leave this as closed, so whenever you turn your camera off, it'll actually close the mechanical shutter in the camera. Personally, I think that's a lifesaver for the camera, as it keeps dust and debris from getting onto the sensor of the camera when it's off. And then we also have our sensor cleaning menu. Our next page, we can reset all of the settings that we just did. We can also set up our custom shooting modes, as well as save and load camera settings on a card. So if we had multiple different R5 cameras, we could actually save the settings from one camera and transfer those over to another camera, so it's set up exactly the same way right off the bat. And then on the last page of this menu, we have our battery info, as well as our copyright information, our manual and software URL, our certification logo, and what our firmware is. All right, so now let's go ahead and jump into our exposure menu. So on the first page of our exposure menu, we can set our level increments to either a third or a half of a stop. We can do the same thing for our ISO speed settings. Then we have the speed from metering and ISO. We can set that to auto or retain. Then we have our bracketing auto cancel, our bracketing sequence, the number of bracketed shots, as well as our safety shift. Then on the next page, we have the same exposure for new aperture. So what this will do is it'll automatically compensate for your exposure if you are changing your aperture. I personally like to leave that off. Next up, we have our AE lock meter mode after focus. We can restrict our shooting modes, as well as set our shutter speed range and our aperture range if we wanted to limit our shutter and our aperture ranges. And then on the next page, we have the option to select our dial direction for our dials on the top of the camera. Next, we have our control ring rotations for your RF lenses that have control rings. We also have our custom button menu, as well as our custom dial menu. Underneath of our custom button menu, we can select what our custom buttons are going to do. Underneath of this menu, you can select pretty much any button that is on the camera and program it to do a number of different functions. So go ahead and play with this menu and see how you like to set your camera up. It's gonna be different for everybody. How I like my camera set up is different from how Matt likes his camera set up, and so on and so forth. So like I was mentioning before, we have the option to set what our dials are going to do. So like I said, I have my front dial set to my shutter speed. I have my back dial on the top set to my aperture. I have my scroll wheel in the middle set to ISO, and then I have my control rings set to be my exposure compensation. And then we can go ahead and clear any of those customized settings if we want to. Then in our next page, we can add our cropping information, our audio compression, our default erase option, our release shutter without lens, retract lens if power off, and our add IPTC information. And then again, we have the option to clear all of our custom settings. So then the last section here on the menus is your custom menu. So you can set this up however you want. Here we can set our picture style, our focus bracketing, our shutter mode, and a bunch of various different options. Then we have the option to add our My Menu tab, delete those tabs, delete the items, as well as your menu display. All right, so next up, we're gonna talk about the video settings. So let's go ahead and put our camera in the video mode, and let's go ahead and jump into those menus. So our first menu is our movie recording quality menu. From here, we can select our movie recording size. And the way that this menu works is the top row is your resolution, the second row is your frame rate, and then the bottom row is your codec. Now, something to keep in mind is that not every option is available in every resolution. If you're recording in 8K, you cannot record in all of the different frame rates. If you're recording in 4K, you can't record in RAW. There are various different options like that, and they will be grayed out if you cannot select them. Also in this menu, you're gonna see your total record time based on how much time is left on your card. After that, we have our movie cropping, so whether or not we want to enable or disable that. Then we have our sound recording menu. Next, we have our exposure compensation. This is very, very similar to the photo menu, so I'm just gonna kind of breeze over this. Most of the settings are pretty much exactly the same. One of the main differences though is that you have the option to select a 1/8 of a stop increment for your exposure adjustment. So then the next menu is our white balance menu. This is basically the exact same menu as we had in our photo menu with the exception of Canon log. So in our log settings, we can either turn that on or off. We can set that to either C-Log or C-Log 3. C-Log 3 is an update in the new firmware. We also have our view assist, our color matrix, our characteristics, as well as our color space. Again, we have our clarity setting, which is exactly the same as our photo menu. On the next page, we have our lens aberration correction, as well as our high ISO speed noise reduction. Again, pretty much the exact same as they were in the photo menu. Next up, we have our HDR movie recording menu, as well as our time-lapse movie menu. These are only available in certain frame rates, like you can't do this in 8K, so make sure that you pay attention to which frame rates and which resolutions you can do this in. Basically, you can't record HDR when you're recording in C-Log. Then on the next page, we have our image stabilizer mode. So that is the digital image stabilization inside the camera. We also have our shutter button function for movies. So your shutter button that is at the front of your camera, you can use that in your movies. Next, we have our metering timer, our zebra settings, our shooting info display, which is again, pretty much the exact same as our photo info. We can select what information we are seeing on the screen. There are various different options for video, but again, basically the same as photo. And underneath of that, we also have our viewfinder display format. Again, same as the photo menu. The next page is our standby, as well as our HDMI display and our timecode menu. Under our timecode menu, we can select how we want it to count up, how we want to start the time settings, if we want to do our movie recording count, our movie play count. We can do all of our timecode settings in this menu. We can also send timecode over HDMI. So next up, we have our autofocus menu. Again, basically the exact same thing as the photo menu, so I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but I will show you the differences. So again, on our first page, we have our autofocus method. Again, same kind of points as we had in our photo menu. We have our subject to detect, so we can do people or animals or no priority if we want to do it that way. We also have our eye detection, which we can only do when we have our facial tracking set in our menus. Then we can select our eye detection, whether or not we want to enable or disable that. We have our movie servo autofocus, so whether or not we want to have continuous autofocus while we are recording a video. Then we also have our touch and drag autofocus settings. This is again the same kind of thing that I was talking about earlier, where we can drag our thumb across the screen to select where our focus point is. This next page is our autofocus speed. Again, the exact same settings as our photo menu, so this will set the speed for how fast our autofocus is going back and forth. We have our electronic lens manual focus, our switching track subjects, lens drive when autofocus is impossible. Again, making something happen recording-wise when there is no autofocus detected, our autofocus limits, as well as our autofocus method selection control. Then we have, again, our focus ring selections, our RF lens manual focus sensitivity, all the same stuff that we had in the photo menus. All right guys, so that's gonna do it for the video today. I hope it was helpful for you. If you have any questions on the Canon R5, go ahead and leave them down in those comments down below. And while you're down there, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That stuff really does help us out here on the channel. Whenever you guys interact with the video, it helps with the YouTube algorithm. So we really do appreciate any comments, any likes, anything like that. That's gonna do it for me today. Thank you for sticking around to the end of this very, very long video. I really do appreciate it. Make sure you guys are staying safe, you're staying healthy, and remember, Gear Focus is always here to help you feed your passion. Peace.